Please be careful with the apples, miss. They bruise easily if you grip them too tight. Thomas Whitman's gentle voice carried across the bustling farmers market in Cedar Creek, Colorado territory on the morning of September 18, 1880. What he didn't know was that the young woman carefully feeling each apple in his display was Isabella Ashford, daughter of the wealthiest man in 3 counties, and that his simple act of kindness would spark a love story that would divide their community and challenge every assumption about worth, dignity, and the true meaning of seeing with the heart. Isabella paused at the sound of his voice, her fingers still resting on the smooth skin of a red delicious apple. At 24, she had learned to navigate the world through touch, sound, and intuition after losing her sight to scarlet fever when she was 12. Most merchants either ignored her completely, assuming her companion would handle the transaction, or spoke to her in the loud, condescending tones people often used with those they considered helpless. Thomas's voice was different, respectful, patient, and addressed directly to her as if her blindness was simply another fact about her, no more significant than the color of her hair. "Thank you for the advice," Isabella replied, loosening her grip on the apple and feeling its perfect roundness with a lighter touch. "I'm not very experienced at choosing fruit. My father's cook usually handles our household purchases." She didn't mention that Judge Ashford kept her carefully sheltered from most aspects of daily life, believing that a blind daughter should be protected from the rough realities of frontier commerce and society. Thomas studied the young woman more carefully, noting her expensive dress, cultured speech, and the way she carried herself with the confidence that came from a privileged upbringing. But he also noticed something else, the slight hesitation in her movements that suggested someone unaccustomed to making independent choices, and a wistfulness in her expression that spoke of a life lived within careful boundaries set by others. "Well, miss, the secret to a good apple is in the feel and the sound," Thomas said, moving around his wooden cart to stand beside her. "May I show you?" When Isabella nodded, he gently guided her hand to different apples, teaching her to feel for firmness without soft spots, to listen for the crisp sound when she tapped the skin lightly with her fingernail, and to notice the subtle differences in weight that indicated ripeness. What happened during those 10 minutes of apple selection would become the foundation of a relationship that challenged everything both Thomas and Isabella thought they knew about love, social expectations, and the courage required to choose happiness over security. For Thomas, a 28-year-old farmer who worked a modest spread 5 miles outside Cedar Creek, Isabella represented everything he had been taught to consider beyond his reach. For Isabella, Thomas's patient teaching and genuine respect offered the first taste of independence and dignity she had experienced since losing her sight. "I'm Thomas Whitman," he said as Isabella selected 6 perfect apples with newfound confidence. "I grow these myself, along with wheat, corn, and vegetables. Been farming the old Peterson place since I bought it from the bank 3 years ago." His introduction was straightforward and honest, with no attempt to inflate his circumstances or apologize for his modest station in life. "I'm Isabella," she replied, then hesitated before adding her surname. In her sheltered world, her father's name and wealth defined how people treated her, and she found herself reluctant to invite the change in Thomas's demeanor that usually followed such revelations. "I live in town with my father." It was a carefully vague description that avoided the reality that Judge Nathan Ashford owned the Cedar Creek Bank, held mortgages on half the ranches in the territory, and wielded political influence that reached all the way to Denver. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Prudence Williams, the banker's wife who served as Isabella's companion and chaperone during her rare ventures into town. Mrs. Williams took one look at Isabella chatting comfortably with a dusty farmer, and immediately moved to reassert proper social boundaries. "Isabella, dear, we must be going," Mrs. Williams said with barely concealed disapproval. "Your father is expecting us back for lunch, and you know how he worries when you're away from home too long." Her tone carried the subtle condescension of someone accustomed to managing the lives of those she considered incapable of managing themselves. But Isabella had experienced something in those few minutes with Thomas that she was reluctant to abandon. "Of course, Mrs. Williams. Mr. Whitman was just teaching me how to select the best apples. I've learned quite a lot." She turned back to Thomas with a smile that seemed to light up her entire face. "Thank you for your patience and your excellent fruit. I hope I'll have occasion to visit your market stall again." Thomas watched as Mrs. Williams efficiently guided Isabella away from his cart, but not before he caught the older woman's disapproving assessment of his worn work clothes, calloused hands, and modest farmer's cart. He understood immediately that he had just met someone whose world was as different from his own as the earth was from the sky, But he also recognized something in Isabella's manner that suggested she might be as constrained by her elevated circumstances as he was by his humble ones. That evening, as Thomas completed his chores and settled into his simple two-room cabin, he found himself thinking about Isabella's genuine interest in learning to judge fruit by feel and sound. Most customers at the market treated his produce as a commodity to be purchased as quickly as possible, but Isabella had approached the selection process as an opportunity to develop a new skill. Her blindness, rather than being a limitation, seemed to have given her a more thoughtful and thorough way of experiencing the world. Meanwhile, across town in the Ashford mansion, Isabella was experiencing her own moments of reflection about the morning's encounter. At dinner, she mentioned meeting a helpful farmer at the market, describing Thomas's patient instruction in apple selection as an example of the courtesy and expertise she had encountered. Judge Ashford listened to his daughter's account with the careful attention he gave to all her rare expressions of enthusiasm. At 58, he had devoted the 12 years since his wife's death to protecting and providing for Isabella, whom he considered both precious and fragile. Her blindness, combined with her sheltered upbringing, had convinced him that she needed constant supervision and protection from a world that would not understand or accommodate her limitations. "I'm glad you had a pleasant morning, my dear," Judge Ashford said, reaching across the table to pat Isabella's hand in the gesture of affectionate condescension he had used since her childhood. "Mrs. Williams tells me you were quite taken with some local produce. Perhaps we should arrange for our cook to purchase directly from reliable suppliers so you won't need to trouble yourself with market visits in the future." Isabella felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came whenever her father's protective instincts threatened to further restrict her limited independence. "I found the market quite educational, Father, and the farmer who helped me was very knowledgeable about his produce. I learned things that might be useful in managing our household." It was a carefully diplomatic response designed to preserve the possibility of future market visits without directly challenging her father's authority. But Judge Ashford's protective radar was finely tuned to detect any situation that might expose his daughter to disappointment, exploitation, or harm. A farmer who had spent extra time teaching Isabella about fruit selection raised questions in the judge's mind about motivation and appropriateness. "Mrs. Williams, perhaps you could give me your impression of this helpful farmer Isabella encountered today." Williams, who prided herself on her ability to assess character and social standing at a glance, delivered her report with the precision of a military briefing. "Thomas Whitman owns a small farm outside town, appears to be honest but obviously of limited means and education. He seemed particularly attentive to Isabella's questions about his produce." The pause before particularly attentive carried clear implications about inappropriate interest from an unsuitable man. The judge's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. In his experience, men who showed special interest in his daughter fell into two categories: fortune hunters attracted by her inheritance, and misguided do-gooders who saw her blindness as an opportunity to demonstrate their own virtue through condescending charity. Either motivation was unacceptable, and both required careful management to protect Isabella from disappointment and potential harm. "I see," Judge Ashford said mildly. "Isabella, while I'm pleased you had an educational experience today, I think it might be best if future household purchasing is handled by our regular suppliers. We wouldn't want to impose on busy farmers or create any misunderstandings about our household's needs." It was a gentle but firm closure of Isabella's tentative steps toward independence, delivered with the loving authority that had shaped her entire adult life. But Isabella had tasted something at the farmer's market that she was not prepared to give up without a fight. For the first time in years, someone had treated her as a capable person worthy of instruction rather than a fragile object requiring protection. Thomas's patient teaching had awakened a hunger for competence and independence that her sheltered life had never satisfied. "Of course, Father," Isabella replied with careful obedience. "But perhaps I could continue visiting the market occasionally for the educational value. I find it helpful to understand how business is conducted, and the social interactions seem good for my development." She was learning to frame her desires in terms of her father's goals for her improvement and protection, finding ways to expand her boundaries without directly challenging his authority. What Isabella didn't know was that her innocent request had set in motion a series of events that would test every relationship in her life and force her to choose between the security of her father's protection and the uncertain promise of genuine love and independence. Because Thomas Whitman, unknown to either Isabella or her father, was also lying awake that night, thinking about their brief encounter and wondering if he would ever see the remarkable young woman who had brought such focused attention to the simple task of choosing apples. The following Saturday, Isabella convinced Mrs. Williams to include the farmer's market in their weekly errands, ostensibly to compare prices and quality with their regular suppliers. Isabella's heart rate increased as they approached Thomas's cart, and she found herself hoping that he would remember her from the previous week. "Miss Isabella," Thomas's voice carried genuine pleasure at seeing her again. "I was hoping you might return to put your new apple selecting skills to the test. I've got some excellent Granny Smiths this week that I think you'd find interesting to evaluate." His greeting was warm but respectful, acknowledging their previous conversation while maintaining appropriate social boundaries. What followed was 20 minutes of animated discussion about seasonal produce, farming techniques, and the challenges of bringing fresh food to market in frontier communities. Isabella peppered Thomas with questions about crop rotation, soil preparation, and the business aspects of small-scale farming, displaying a curiosity and intelligence that impressed him and alarmed Mrs. Williams in equal measure. Thomas found himself explaining complex agricultural concepts to someone who grasped them quickly and asked thoughtful follow-up questions. Isabella's blindness seemed to sharpen her analytical thinking, and she approached farming as an intellectual puzzle worthy of serious study. Her genuine interest in his work was unlike anything Thomas had experienced in his dealings with town people, who usually viewed farming as simple physical labor requiring no particular skill or knowledge. "It sounds like farming is as much about planning and problem-solving as it is about physical work," Isabella observed as Thomas explained his decision to diversify crops to reduce market risk. The business aspects seemed quite complex. Her comment revealed an understanding of economic principles that surprised Thomas and suggested education and intelligence far beyond what he might have expected from a sheltered young woman. Mrs. Williams watched this intellectual exchange with growing alarm. Isabella was displaying more animation and engagement than she had shown in months, and the young farmer was clearly enjoying the opportunity to discuss his work with someone who took it seriously. The mutual respect and interest between them was becoming increasingly obvious, and Mrs. Williams recognized the danger of allowing such a friendship to develop. "Isabella, we really must complete our errands," Mrs. Williams interrupted with polite firmness. "Your father is expecting a full report on our market research, and we don't want to keep him waiting." It was a diplomatic way of ending the conversation while reminding everyone present of Judge Ashford's authority over Isabella's activities. But as they prepared to leave, Isabella made a decision that would change the trajectory of both their lives. "Mr. Whitman, I've found our discussions about farming quite educational. Would it be appropriate for me to visit your farm sometime to see these agricultural techniques in practice? I'm sure my father would approve of educational experiences that broaden my understanding of our community's economy." The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that all three people understood but none wished to address directly. Thomas recognized that accepting such a visit would inevitably lead to complications with Isabella's family and social circle. Mrs. Williams understood that allowing such a visit would cross important social boundaries and potentially encourage inappropriate hopes in both young people. But Thomas also recognized that Isabella was asking for something more than a farm tour. She was asking for continued intellectual stimulation, for treatment as a capable person worthy of serious conversation, and for the kind of respect that her sheltered life rarely provided. His answer would either support her tentative steps toward independence, or reinforce the protective barriers that kept her isolated from meaningful engagement with the world. "I would be honored to show you the farm, Miss Isabella," Thomas replied after a moment's consideration. "There's always interesting work happening, and I think you'd find the seasonal changes in crop management quite educational. Of course, any visit would need to meet with your father's approval and include appropriate supervision." His acceptance was carefully qualified to address Mrs. Williams's concerns, while still offering Isabella the educational experience she sought. Mrs. Williams knew that she was witnessing the beginning of something that Judge Ashford would find deeply troubling, but she also recognized that forbidding the visit outright might drive Isabella to more secretive rebellion. "We'll certainly discuss this with your father, Isabella. Any educational visits would need to be properly arranged and supervised, of course." That evening's dinner conversation at the Ashford mansion was more charged than usual, though the tension remained beneath the surface of polite family discourse. Isabella raised the possibility of visiting a local farm to observe agricultural practices, framing her request as an extension of her market research and general education about their community's economic foundation. Judge Ashford listened to his daughter's proposal with the careful attention he gave to all legal arguments, analyzing not just what was said but what motivations and interests lay beneath the surface. Isabella's sudden interest in agricultural education coincided suspiciously with her enthusiasm for market visits, and Mrs. Williams's carefully neutral report suggested complications that warranted closer examination. "My dear," Judge Ashford said with gentle authority, "while I admire your interest in understanding our local economy, I'm not sure that farm visits are the most appropriate way to pursue such education. Perhaps we could arrange for some reading materials about agricultural practices, or invite a knowledgeable speaker to discuss farming techniques with you here at home. Isabella felt the familiar frustration of having her requests deflected and redirected toward safer, more controlled alternatives. But she had also inherited her father's persistence and strategic thinking, and she was learning to advocate for herself with increasing skill. "I appreciate your concern, Father, but I find that I learn much better through direct observation and conversation than through reading. My blindness makes it difficult to fully understand written descriptions of physical processes, but I can learn quite a lot through careful listening and appropriate touching." It was a compelling argument that used Isabella's disability as a justification for the very independence and exposure that her father's protective instincts worked to prevent. Judge Ashford found himself in the uncomfortable position of either acknowledging his daughter's learning needs or revealing that his objections were based on social rather than educational concerns. "I understand your learning preferences, Isabella," he replied carefully, "but farm visits raise questions of propriety and safety that concern me. Rural settings can be unpredictable, and I worry about exposing you to environments that might not accommodate your needs appropriately." It was a diplomatic way of expressing his real concern, that unsupervised contact with unsuitable men might lead to complications that would threaten Isabella's security and his own peace of mind. But Isabella had spent years learning to read the subtle meanings beneath her father's diplomatic language, and she recognized that his objections had less to do with physical safety than with social control. "Perhaps such visits could be arranged with appropriate supervision and safety measures," she suggested. "Mrs. Williams could accompany me, and we could limit the visits to times when farming activities would be most educational." Judge Ashford realized that his daughter's growing assertiveness was going to require more direct management. Isabella's blindness had made her dependent on others for mobility and daily tasks, but it had also sharpened her other faculties and given her plenty of time to develop her intellectual and persuasive abilities. She was becoming harder to manage through gentle deflection, and more direct opposition risked the kind of family conflict he had worked 12 years to avoid. "We'll consider the matter further," he said with the tone of judicial finality that usually ended such discussions. "In the meantime, I think it might be wise to focus your educational interests on subjects more directly relevant to your future circumstances." It was a gentle but clear signal that Isabella's requests for greater independence were being officially tabled pending further consideration that might never come. But as the judge retired to his study that evening, he made a decision that would escalate the situation beyond anything Isabella or Thomas had anticipated. He instructed Mrs. Williams to make discreet inquiries about Thomas Whitman's background, financial circumstances, and reputation in the community. If his daughter was developing inappropriate interests, Judge Ashford intended to understand exactly what kind of threat he was dealing with and how it could be managed most effectively. The investigation that followed revealed Thomas to be exactly what he appeared: an honest, hard-working farmer of modest means and good reputation who had never shown interest in social climbing or fortune hunting. His purchase of the Peterson farm had been handled through legitimate business channels, his mortgage payments were current, and his interactions with other community members were consistently described as fair and reliable. But Judge Ashford's inquiry also revealed something else. Thomas Whitman was exactly the kind of man who might genuinely care about Isabella as a person, rather than as a financial opportunity. His lack of social ambition and apparent contentment with his modest circumstances suggested someone whose interest in Isabella might be based on personal compatibility rather than calculated advantage-seeking. Paradoxically, this made Thomas more dangerous from Judge Ashford's perspective, not less. A fortune hunter could be bought off or legally threatened into withdrawal. A genuinely caring man who saw Isabella as an individual worthy of respect and affection represented a much more complex threat to the protected world the judge had constructed around his daughter. The crisis came to a head 2 weeks later when Isabella, with characteristic determination, arranged her own farm visit through carefully coordinated deception that surprised everyone with its sophistication and effectiveness. Telling her father she was visiting friends in town and instructing Mrs. Williams that the social visit had been canceled in favor of educational errands, Isabella hired a buggy and driver to take her to Thomas's farm for the agricultural tour she had been systematically denied. Thomas was surprised but delighted to see Isabella arrive at his farm on a crisp October morning, accompanied only by the hired driver who was to return for her after 2 hours. "Miss Isabella, I wasn't expecting you today, but you've chosen an excellent time for a farm tour. I'm just finishing the corn harvest, and I can show you the whole process from field to storage." What followed were 2 hours that both Thomas and Isabella would remember for the rest of their lives as the moment when friendship transformed into something deeper and more dangerous. Thomas guided Isabella through every aspect of his operation, letting her feel the difference between properly dried corn and grain that needed more time in the field, explaining the mechanics of his harvesting equipment, and describing the seasonal rhythms that governed his work and planning. But more than learning about farming, Isabella experienced for the first time what it felt like to be treated as a fully capable adult, whose opinions and observations were valued and respected. Thomas asked for her thoughts on efficiency improvements, sought her advice on business decisions, and engaged her in problem-solving discussions as if her blindness was irrelevant to her ability to think and contribute. "You know, Miss Isabella," Thomas said as they sat on his porch after the tour, drinking coffee and discussing crop rotation strategies, "you have a remarkable head for business. Your questions about diversification and risk management are exactly the kinds of things I should be thinking about more systematically." It was perhaps the first time in Isabella's adult life that anyone had complimented her intelligence rather than her patience in dealing with her disability. Isabella felt something shift inside her chest as she realized what she was experiencing. She was falling in love not just with Thomas, but with the version of herself that emerged in his company. With him, she was not Judge Ashford's blind daughter, who needed protection and management. She was simply Isabella, a woman whose thoughts and feelings and preferences mattered because Thomas found her interesting rather than pitiable. "Thomas," she said, using his first name for the first time, "may I ask you something personal?" When he encouraged her to continue, she took a breath and asked the question that had been forming in her mind throughout their time together. "Do you see my blindness as something that makes me less capable of living a full life?" The question revealed the depth of Isabella's hunger for honest assessment rather than protective reassurance. Thomas considered his answer carefully, recognizing that his response would either support her growing confidence or reinforce the limitations that others had taught her to accept. "Isabella," he said, matching her use of first names, "I think your blindness has made you more capable in some ways, not less. You listen more carefully than anyone I know, you think through problems more thoroughly, and you don't get distracted by appearances when you're trying to understand what's really important. I'd rather have your advice on farming decisions than that of most sighted people I know." It was the answer Isabella had hoped for but had never dared to expect, and it opened floodgates of emotion that had been carefully controlled for 12 years. She began to cry, not from sadness but from relief at finally hearing someone acknowledge her competence rather than her courage in overcoming limitations. Thomas, alarmed by her tears but recognizing their significance, moved his chair closer to hers and asked gently, "Isabella, are you unhappy with your life at home?" It was a dangerous question that ventured into territory that could have serious consequences for both of them, but Thomas had come to care about Isabella's well-being more than his own safety. "I'm grateful for my father's care and protection," Isabella replied carefully, "but sometimes I feel like I'm living half a life. Everyone treats me as if I'm too fragile for real challenges or real choices. You're the first person who's ever asked what I think about anything that matters." Her honesty was risky, but Thomas's respectful treatment had created a space where truth seemed safer than careful diplomacy. The conversation that followed lasted until the driver returned, and reluctantly interrupted what had clearly become an intimate discussion between two people discovering their feelings for each other. By the time Isabella returned to town, both she and Thomas understood that they had crossed a line from friendship into something that would inevitably create conflict with her family and their community. Judge Ashford's reaction to Isabella's unauthorized farm visit was swift and decisive. Mrs. Williams's report of Isabella's deception, combined with the judge's growing concerns about Thomas's influence on his daughter, convinced him that direct intervention was necessary to protect Isabella from her own poor judgment and unsuitable romantic attachments. The confrontation that evening was the most serious disagreement Isabella had had with her father since childhood, and it forced both of them to acknowledge truths they had been avoiding about her need for independence and his struggle to accept her growing autonomy. "Isabella," Judge Ashford began with the controlled anger of a man who rarely had his authority challenged, "your behavior today was dishonest, dangerous, and completely inappropriate for a young woman in your circumstances. You deliberately deceived both Mrs. Williams and myself, exposed yourself to potential harm, and engaged in unsuitable social interactions that reflect poorly on our family's reputation." Isabella had spent the afternoon preparing for this confrontation, and she met her father's anger with a calm determination that surprised them both. "Father, I apologize for the deception, which was wrong, but I don't apologize for seeking educational experiences and adult friendships that treat me as a capable person rather than a fragile child." The directness of Isabella's challenge forced Judge Ashford to articulate concerns he had previously expressed only through protective action. "Isabella, you don't understand the dangers of encouraging inappropriate attachments. Men like Thomas Whitman may seem sincere, but they cannot provide the security and protection that your circumstances require. Your blindness makes you vulnerable to exploitation and disappointment that could cause you tremendous pain. My blindness makes me different, Father, but it doesn't make me incapable of good judgment about people's character, Isabella replied with growing confidence. Thomas has shown me nothing but respect and kindness. He values my opinions, encourages my independence, and treats me as an adult capable of making my own decisions. These are qualities I value in a friend, regardless of his social status. Judge Ashford recognized that Isabella was developing arguments and assertiveness skills that made simple parental authority insufficient to manage her choices. She was becoming an adult woman with her own ideas about what kind of life she wanted, and those ideas increasingly conflicted with his vision of what was best for her safety and happiness. Isabella, I understand your desire for independence, but you must be realistic about your limitations and the kind of future that will provide you with security and happiness. Marriage to a struggling farmer would mean hardship, isolation, and responsibilities that might prove overwhelming. A more suitable arrangement could provide you with companionship while maintaining the comfort and protection you need. The word arrangement revealed Judge Ashford's assumption that Isabella's future husband would be chosen based on practical considerations rather than personal affection, an assumption that directly conflicted with the emotional awakening she was experiencing through her relationship with Thomas. Father, are you suggesting that my husband should be chosen based on his ability to maintain me in comfortable dependence rather than on mutual respect and affection? Isabella's question forced her father to defend a position that sounded less reasonable when stated explicitly than it had seemed when operating as unspoken assumption. Judge Ashford found himself articulating beliefs about his daughter's future that he had never examined critically. I'm suggesting that your happiness and security require careful consideration of practical realities as well as personal feelings. Love is a luxury that people in your circumstances cannot always afford to prioritize over stability and protection. It was perhaps the most honest statement Judge Ashford had ever made about his expectations for Isabella's life, and its implications horrified her. She realized that her father saw her blindness not as a challenge she could learn to manage, but as a permanent incapacity that disqualified her from the kind of life based on personal choice and mutual partnership that other adults took for granted. Father, do you believe that I'm incapable of contributing to a marriage as an equal partner? Isabella asked quietly. Do you think my only value to a husband would be as a financial burden that he accepts in exchange for my inheritance? The question cut to the heart of Judge Ashford's deepest fears about Isabella's future and forced him to confront assumptions he had never examined honestly. He loved his daughter deeply, but his protective instincts had led him to underestimate her capabilities and overestimate her limitations in ways that were actually harmful to her development and happiness. Isabella, I think you underestimate the challenges that your blindness would create in a marriage, particularly to someone without the resources to provide adequate support and assistance. I want you to be happy, but I also want you to be realistic about what kind of life would actually provide that happiness. Isabella realized that this conversation was not just about Thomas or her farm visit, but about fundamental disagreements between her and her father about her capacity for independence, contribution, and choice. The conflict would not be resolved by promises to be more careful or by compromises about supervised visits. It required a decision about what kind of future she wanted and whether she had the courage to pursue it despite her father's objections. Father, I respect your concern for my welfare, but I can't accept your assessment of my limitations or your assumptions about what will make me happy. I've discovered that I'm capable of much more than our protected household has allowed me to explore, and I've met someone who values me for my mind and character, rather than tolerating me despite my blindness. Judge Ashford recognized that Isabella was not just asserting her independence, but articulating a fundamentally different vision of her future than the one he had constructed around her needs and limitations. The conversation had evolved beyond a disagreement about appropriate behavior into a conflict between two incompatible approaches to Isabella's life. The crisis reached its climax when Isabella made a declaration that neither she nor her father had anticipated, but that crystallized the issues that had been building between them for months. Father, I believe Thomas Whitman cares about me as a person, and I believe I'm falling in love with him. If he asks me to marry him, I intend to accept, regardless of your objections or the disapproval of our social circle. I would prefer your blessing, but I no longer require your permission to live my life as I choose. The words hung in the air between them with the finality of a line drawn in the sand. Isabella had transformed from a dutiful daughter seeking her father's approval into an independent woman claiming the right to make her own choices about love and marriage. Judge Ashford realized that his protective authority had reached its limits, and that future attempts to control Isabella's choices would require methods he was not prepared to use. What followed would test both Isabella's newfound independence and Thomas's commitment to their relationship, as Judge Ashford implemented a strategy designed to separate them permanently and force Isabella to confront the practical realities of choosing love over security. The battle for Isabella's future was about to begin in earnest, and the outcome would determine not just her happiness, but the kind of woman she would become and the kind of life she would build for herself.